It is now 4 p.m. local time. Good afternoon from Manila. We are live streaming on the conference YouTube channel and the National Centennial Committee Facebook page. Good afternoon to all of you in this Zoom room and on social media. I'm Ruben Mendoza, Chair of the Department of Theology, and I will be your moderator for today. The Department of Theology is happy to host today's panel on religious institutions. We have a packed program this afternoon. We will have part one from 4 to 5:30 with presentations from Elsa Penalba, Kevin Carreras Suarez, who are both joining us from Lisbon, and Father Joaquin Jose Marie Sumpaico from Manila. We will have a Q&A, then proceed with part two. Part two will be from 5:30 to 7 p.m. and we will have presentations from Father Jose Elias Manalastas, Father Ansem OSP from Manila, and Father Antonio de Castro, SJ from Zamboanga. And now, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Elsa Pinalba. She is a researcher from CHUM, Centro de Humanidades of the Facultade de Ciencias Sociales Humanas, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, Universidade dos Açores. Among her main works are Mulheres en Macau Donas Honradas, Mulheres Escravas, and I'll let you read the other ones, else I'm afraid that I will be murdering the language itself, so to read for yourself. She was the principal researcher for the project Prosopography of the Resident and Itinerant Portuguese Communities in the Philippines, 1582 to 1654, which was financed by the Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia. So that's Elsa Pinauca. Oops, sorry. Okay. Her presentation is entitled The Elites of the Holy House of Mercy of Macau and the Philippines from 1590 to 1645.
Can I?
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, Paula will now share her PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Elsa will. Okay. You have the floor.
Can I speak? Sorry.
Yes,
No.
please.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. My greetings to all. I thanks to Tenio de Manila for being able to participate in this conference. I thanks to Miguel Rodrigues Lourenço for the help he gave me with the PowerPoint, and to Paulo Pinto for his help with the PowerPoint as I speak. Please, I apologize, but I will have to read my contribution. First part, multiculturalism and inclusion. In the words of Miguel Pinto, a Chinese man and surely a member of the Misericordia de Macau after 1627, when the Chinese minority was included among its elites, even saw the Compromisso da Misericordia of the same year, which was reformulated in 1638, demanded its members had to be Portuguese to be accepted in the Brotherhood. Miguel Pinto was the Chinese interpreter Jurubasa in service of the Macanese Senate Chamber between 1625 and 1645 and who spoke in the city's name. The voyage were lands that Macau lived off. If we invoke a Jurubasa, a Chinese that belongs to the Chinese elite of interpreted Jurubasas of Macau, who played a key role in the relationship between the city, the provincial, and the Chinese imperial power, a Chinese man co-opted by the Jesuits in the sustenance and survival networks of Macau. We do so because not only does it uniquely express the importance that these voyages, one of which was to Manila, had to Macau, but also because it is a showcase for how much the survival and sustenance of the city depend in large measure on its multicultural and mixed society, which result from the different people that's integrated. It was thanks to the intervention of a merchant network that belonged to the Misericórdia de Macau elite and that included António Fialho Ferreira that a young Philippine woman described in the Macanese Memorial of 1619 as being as Princess Daughter of the King of Pampanga, that a young Philippine woman became one of three nuns with the most impact in the Convento de Santa Clara de Macau and the city itself. Among the three nuns we reference, there was a Portuguese Japanese woman, Beatriz da Costa or da Silva, born in Nagasaki, in the Macanese Spanish woman, Maria Madalena de la Cruz, born in Pinto, near Madrid, and a Philippine woman from the island of Luzon, from the province of Pampanga. The convent de Santa Clara de Macau, where Leocardo Fialho Ferreira, daughter of António Fialho Ferreira, professed, was socially multicultural and mixed, composed of Portuguese Asian Eurasians, daughter of Portuguese men, and Asian women of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian origin. Among the latter we find Mother Ana do Sacramento, born in Manila, who in 1633 was taken to Macau by the founding nuns when she was only 10 years old. She was the daughter of a slave and the Portuguese merchant Gaspar Mendes, a Franciscan tertiary, born in Évora and responsible for the construction of the Misericórdia de Manila church, who donated 2,000 taéis as dowry. According to the author of the Clarissas de Macau Memorial, which was based on a modeled after another text created in Manila with information that had been requested from Macau, Marta de São Bernardino, the profession name by which the Philippine nun that we're talking about is referred to in the memorial we cited. Even so, she appears as Marta de São Bernardo in Castilian sources. Marta de São Bernardino had evidenced herself by the compassion and empathy she showed for others. To Macau, where she lived between 1633, where she arrived still a novice on her arrival here, and December 3rd in 1683, that the date of her passing, Marta de São Bernardino or de São Bernard had lived, according to that same Portuguese source, a life marked by her family's opposition to her aim of becoming a poor clerk before she was a nun, still being secular and inspired by her charisma. Her own gave her the cult, the veneration of being virtuous. And as we know from the trajectory of Jerónimo de la Assunção, of Mother Leonor de São Francisco and Mother Maria Madalena de la Cruz, the opposition from the Philippine Spanish elites and the Franciscan provincial friar António de São Gregório, and called Luciano Santiago. In Macau, where she arrived at 17 years of age, she was the mistress of novice and elected abbess in 1664. Despite the social segregation inherent to the structure of Macau society in the 16th and 17th century, the more we work the primary sources, namely those in written form, the more inclusion dynamics we detect as a means to strengthen the she was the mistress of novice and elected abbess in the growth of Macau Manila axis despite in the decades social segregation of 1620 and 1630, confirming the effectiveness of the multicultural and mixed the more we work the primary sustenance and survival networks of Macau. The more inclusion dynamics of not just Spanish but also Hispanic Americans who were connection links to Manila and New Spain. Mother Leonor de São Francisco and Mother Maria Madalena de la Cruz, of their own volition but also due to intervention from Portuguese merchants that belonged to the Macanizela elite, namely the Misericordia and inclusion Chinese territory, one of the main missions of Mother Jerónimo de la Assunção and Mother Maria Madalena de la Cruz. They enacted a mission, and by doing so strengthened the Franciscan circle of influence in Macau. The fact that the Philippine novices arrived together in the founding of namely nuns in Macau also established a connection, one of the main missions of ethnicity. We do not know how many Filipinos lived in Macau, even so, they were part of the city's seasonal population. and whether or not this community was part of the support of the nuns' devotion. But the fact that Margaret São Bernardino or Margaret São Bernardo was the only nun with devotes in the Clarissa of Macau, Clarissas of Macau Memorial is a sign that her personality had overflowed the convent community, usually contaminated by the city life through the families and the devotees that frequent the locutory. Referred to by the author of the Memorial of the Poor Clares of Macau as an Ilustríssima Irmã, illustrious sister, as the only nun distinguished in this way. His biography in the penultimate in the memorial, a fact that does not fit with his content. And at the end of his life, she had a candor that we could hardly resist sharing. Here's the narration of one of his visions according to his biography, as the because that
Yeah,
was
excuse me, Elsa.
yes,
Excuse me, I thought the PowerPoint presentation is not
yes. Thank you very
progressing.
much.
Is that okay?
Thank you. Please apologize. Is the first information in the PowerPoint. Please follow.
Ah, okay. Okay, so just
Oh, thank you very much. This is the source that
yeah.
we can
Excuse me, Elsa.
find the information about
Excuse me, I
Market
thought
São
the
Bernardino.
PowerPoint
Thank you very much.
presentation
Thank you.
is not okay.
And
Progressing.
here's the
okay?
narration of one of his visions according to his biography, because that's what information inside of the place where she was, a very dark place. Inside, she saw all the nuns with their guardian angels at their side into the choir. And in the choir, she saw the angels and the nuns all mixed in the choir, praising their creators. And she saw more, that these nuns' angels took the words from the nuns' mouths and handed them over to the other little angels, and these flew and disappeared with those praises of the Lord. Thank you. And second part, social networks. Please, Paulo, the second. Thank you very much. Lobo Sarmento Carvalho, according to your self-representation, in 1645, the year he died, never been part of the Senado da Câmara de Macau, despite having been twice the provider of the Holy Mercy of Macau. This fact made us question the way he related to his brother-in-law, António Fialho Ferreira, who was the Misericórdia clerk in 1628 and 1629. From his question, we try to find how the Lobo Sarmento Carvalho social network was configured, how this social work was streamlined, and what changes it had until 1637, the year in which the Senado discussed for the third time issues related to the control of the clergy. 1637 was also the year that the Lobo Sarmento Carvalho network changed with respect to the Manila voyage. At the year after which this merchant joined the group of good men more active in council meetings, in approaching the elites of Holy Mercy, taking into account their relationship with the Philippines, we start from biographies of merchants who held the positions of providers, clerks, and treasurers between 1591 and 1637. Please, the other, please, thank you very much. And the other two, please, Paul. Okay, thank you very much. In approaching the elites of Holy Mercy, taking the cult, their relationship with the Philippines, we start from the biographies of merchants who held positions of providers, clerks, and treasurers between 1591 and 1637. Taking into account, in view of the questionnaire that we started with, it is important to bear in mind some facts of chronology relating to the biographies of Lobo Sarmento Carvalho and António Fialho Ferreira. On November 9, in 1620, Lobo Sarmento Carvalho had not the support of his father-in-law or brother-in-law when a council meeting was discussed whether the ships from India should depart or not in response to the Dutch threat. The rapprochement and support of António Fialho Ferreira and Jorge Cerqueira as partner of their monopoly project came after the opposition of the Macau Senate to the purchase of Japan Travel monopoly in the same year. In the 1621, the voyage from Japan had yielded more than 3 million florins of raw silk and other goods from Japan. And this year began the opposition of the elites of the Senate of Macau, who in 1622 asked for the sale to be annulled by the crown. In this year, Lobo Sarmento Carvalho also lost his preeminence as capital mor, and there was attempt to ostracize this mission also by the elites with access to the Senate. It was in 1624 that António Fialho Ferreira and Jorge Sequeira, the father-in-law, began a strategy to support Lobo Sarmento Carvalho, who, in his return from Goa in 1623, had become a prisoner of the Dutch in Batavia. The strategy included support from Capitão-General Dom Francisco Mascarenhas, please call the other. Thank you. By the crown. And this year, yes, thank you very much. And you, yes, and the other one, please. Attempt to ostracize this mission, also by the elites with access to the Senate. It was in 1624 that António Fialho Ferreira and Jorge Sequeira, the father-in-law. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. The strategy includes support from Capitão-General Dom Francisco Mascarenhas as Capitão-General from the father-in-law against elites who wanted to annul his appointment. António Fialho Ferreira and Jorge Sequeira, or Sequeira, it's important, at the request, the Captain-General gave favorable opinions to his proposal on how the trip to Manila should be made by the Crown. Also, the vast majority of those called up agreed so as not to lose the investment made in the trip since 1623. There were those who were absolutely against it. We are referring to citizens with great power or political, social and economic intervention in Macau, Ponciano de Abreu and Domingos Carvalho, a united economic front. Two merchants who, together with some who circumstantially given their positive opinion, set up the opposition to the Captain-General together with Society of Jesus. António Fialho Ferreira and certainly Jorge Sequeira, according to the involvement of Sequeira in the Manila voyage in 1633, together with António Fialho Ferreira, made the approach to the circle of terciários franciscanos in Macau. They do this source Bartolomeu da Rocha and their sister Isabel da Rocha. Toulouse or Indians mestizos with connection to Chinese. This was a merchant with great economic power. Afonso António Fialho Ferreira, which in 1624 identified himself as the main citizen, traveled to Manila to have his face on the strategy was the end. With the support of the Rocha brothers, he contacted Jerónimo de Assunção and Portuguese merchant Gaspar Mendes, a benefactor of the Poor Clares Convent in Manila, together with another Portuguese, João Pereira. Gaspar Mendes was a Bartolomeu da Rocha economic partner and belonged to the merchant Francisco da Gama networks, which had links to Lobo Sarmento Carvalho. Between 1624, perhaps before, and 1629, António Fialho Ferreira and Jorge Sequeira, Lobo Sarmento Carvalho of the Rocha brothers, contacted Jerónimo de Assunção, get closer to the merchant Gaspar Mendes, a benefactor of the Poor Clares Convent. This is the clerk and provided in 1617 and 1622. In 1625, Gaspar Homem was elected by the Senate to go canton, and for this reason, he belonged to one of the main political, economic, social elites in Macau. In 1628, António Fialho Ferreira was elected clerk of the Santa Casa da Misericórdia. It makes an approach to the Society of Jesus through alms, by a balance following the example of the Rocha brothers, of the example of Gaspar Mendes in Manila. In 1629, in a year in which António Fialho Ferreira was a clerk of Holy House of Mercy of Macau for the second time, yes, please see, was a clerk of Holy House of Mercy of Macau for the second time, Lobo Sarmento Carvalho advanced by taking advantage of the support base that his brother-in-law had built in Macau and he himself in Goa. In this year, Lobo Sarmento Carvalho was Cavaleiro da Ordem de Cristo as a reward for his performance as Capitão-Mor in 1622 in Dutch attack on Macau on 24 June. Together with António Fialho Ferreira, Gaspar Homem, André Lima and Manuel de Moraes Pico, purchased the travel monopoly from Japan and Manila for 306,000 giraffins. The partner faced the opposition of the Senate in Macau. The Macau Senate successfully prevented the execution of the Japan portion of the trip in 1630 and 1631. António Ferreira executed the contract portion of the Manila voyage with highly profitable annual trips. António Ferreira had brought raw silk to Manila worth about 1.5 million pesos. The Viceroy, Dom Miguel de Noronha, intervened, nullifying the opposition of the Senate. Lope Sarmiento Carvalho made the voyage in 1632, 1633, and 1634 and get 490 silver chests. In 1632 and 1633, António Fialho Ferreira and his brother João Fialho Ferreira advanced in Manila with successive loans to Real Hacienda by order of the government. The circle of Tertiarios Franciscanos is also advancing. Batúlio da Rocha supported the project of founding a convent of poor clerics, sought financial support and the cession of their homes. Diego Henrique de Lozada, a tertiary Franciscan, wrote to governor. In 1633, António Fialho Ferreira went to Manila as a feitor, together with a relative, a nephew, or a brother-in-law, the Almirante Nicolau Sequeira. They make a loan, forced the court to charge Boxer of 19,000 pesos, and António Fialho Ferreira also advanced com sua persona, giving a bail, com sua persona y bienes muebles y raízes habidos de por haber. They invest heavily and fearlessly. João Fialho Ferreira was in Manila in 1632 and in 1633 with a partner named Francisco Coelho. He made successive loans to Real Hacienda in a total of 24,600 pesos de ouro comum by order of government. António Fialho Ferreira and João Fialho Ferreira, in their return to Macau, they take the founding nuns of the poor clerics of Macau. In 1634, Macau did not send directly any ships to Manila. In 1635, João Fialho Ferreira was in Manila and António Fialho Ferreira is nominated elect by the Senado to represent the city in Canton together with one Macau's most powerful merchants, Vicente Rodrigues. It was an absolute victory. In 1636, given the choice by Viceroy da India, Dom Miguel de Noronha, of Gaspar Mendes de Fonseca to make the trip to Manila, Lope Sarmiento Carvalho used another strategy. The last we will explain. Gaspar Borges da Fonseca was one of the Macau merchants with access to the Senate since 1621. In 1625 was procurador for the Senate. In 1635 was elected clerk of the Holy House of Mercy of Macau. In 1636 was vereador, councillor of municipal government. It was part of two circles of power in Macau. In response, Lope Sarmiento Carvalho associates with Lourenço Luís de Velho, a merchant with undisputed prestige. He was Cavaleiro do Hábito de Santiago. In 1622, he was chosen as captain of the Macau relief to Peking. He was the son of a Capitão Mor of Setúbal. He and António Fialho Ferreira were practically countrymen. They belonged to the same self-referential group. Lourenço Luís Velho held the office of good clerk of Holy House of Mercy of Macau in 1630 and 1631. He had belonged to the Senate in 1621 and in 1625, like Gaspar Borges da Fonseca. Lourenço Luís Velho has a career as impressive as Gaspar Borges da Fonseca, more because of his election to Capitão do Socorro in Peking in 1622. In 1636, Lope Sarmiento Carvalho chose Lourenço Luís Velho for its Capitão Mor from a voyage to Manila. From this year onwards, Lope Sarmiento Carvalho guarantees his place among the town people at the council meeting. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elsa, for your presentation. Now we will proceed to our second speaker, whom I will introduce first. Our second speaker is Kevin Carrera Suarez, with a degree in history and a master's in early modern history from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Coimbra. Kevin Carrera Suarez is a student of the Inter-University Doctoral Program in History, Change and Continuity in a Global World. He received a scholarship from the Foundation for Science and Technology. Currently, he is writing a thesis entitled Episcopacy and Power, the Construction of the Iberian Empires in Early Modern Asia, under the supervision of Angela Barrera Xavier and Joseph Pedro Paiva. His areas of interest and specialization are the history of the Iberian empires, ecclesiastical history, political history, and connected history. Wow. Okay. Sorry. Oops. Kevin's presentation will be on bishoprics in the Iberian Peninsula and in Asia in comparative perspective, the 16th to the 17th centuries. Kevin, you have the floor.
Well, good morning to you all. I would like to thank the kind presentation, and I would like to greet everyone in the Philippines, as well as my colleagues in Lisbon, and be thankful for the opportunity to speak on this conference. I'm going to start immediately in order not to take too much time. Having existed since the 5th century, dioceses are among the most important and institutions in the Iberian Peninsula. With the territorial conquests of the 10th and 11th century over Muslim territories that we know locally as Reconquista or Reconquista, the old dioceses of the Roman and Visigoth periods were gradually reinstituted, after following more or less the same limits. In the 14th century, the limits of the Portuguese and Castilian bishoprics were modified to overlap the territorial frontiers of both Portuguese and Castilian crowns. The 16th century was, however, the period where most noteworthy modifications took place, starting with the foundation of a large number of bishoprics, both in Europe and outside, and with the transformation of the role of bishops as ecclesiastical and political agents. And that is the period that I'm going to have under analysis here. With the beginning of the Iberian expansion process, the transfer and replication of institutions from the Iberian territory to the newly conquered and occupied territories was one of the major traits of this effort in the attempts to control the territories. In the areas of justice, military, and fiscal or political administration, many of the pre-existing institutions were replicated, even if with many adaptations. Having in mind the historiographical debates about the process of confessionalization and their importance for the consolidation of the power in Europe, as well as some recent debates on territorialization, this paper objective is to look specifically to the bishopric institutional presence, aiming to answer these three main problems. Were the Iberian experiences a key element in understanding the creation of new bishoprics in Asia during the 16th century? Can it be said that the reason for the growing number of dioceses in the Iberian Peninsula and in Asia in this period are connected and interrelated? Finally, is the creation of a new bishopric part of the process of territorialization, as some historians that study the evolution of justice or local government institutions in America have suggested? I will argue that the 16th century was particularly favorable for the creation of new dioceses, both because the Iberian crowns were undertaking processes of territorial reform, and as a result of the proximity with the Council of Trent. On other perspective, there is no question that the levels of territorialization in Europe and in Asia in the 16th century had very different outcomes. Looking for both cases simultaneously, I'll conclude that the episcopal institutional density was much more solid in the Iberian territories in the end of the 16th century than it was in Asia. And for me, this is the result of 5 main reasons. Ecclesiastical institutions are, by definition, prone to have memory of their previous status and support their prestige on notions of longevity. In this dynamic, there was a different starting point in Europe and in Asia, and that established the grounds for distinct outcomes. The second one is that dioceses created under the Iberian Padroados were dependent on the crown's financial ability to sustain them, which made these foundations more interrelated to other conjectural factors, such as the need to ensure financial availability to cover for costs such as those related to growing military conflicts. The same was not true in Europe, where bishoprics had their own sources of income and the crown could not collect ecclesiastical tributes in the same way, or it could, but with less intensity. Also, the third one is that the distance from the political centers created difficulties for the creation of new dioceses. As the process was often started by, or had to be started by the courts in Madrid or in Lisbon, and also it was often started by a bishop that would request more bishoprics to his jurisdiction. Now, we know that in the 17th century, most bishoprics in Southeast Asia are vacant for long decades. So this doesn't help. Also for different reasons, the Philippines were not perceived as highly attractive conversion territories for European missionaries, in contrast to what took place in Japan, for instance, since the end of the 16th century. Here, many plans of diocesan reform were debated within Lisbon, Madrid, and Rome in the first half of the 17th century. The same was true in China, Siam, Tonkin, or Vietnam in different chronologies. This made the projects of creation of new dioceses in the Philippines very scarce in the 17th century, in opposition to what was taking place in other Asiatic territories, where propaganda fide, for instance, was very active from early on, even sending bishops appointed directly under Roman authority. The large influence, and the last reason is the large influence of the religious orders in the Philippines, to whom the episcopal jurisdiction was often a source for conflict. And this also made the creation of new bishoprics less probable. Now, even if all these reasons are interrelated, I'll look specifically to the territorial dimension of bishoprics in Asia and in Europe, and leave those other reasons aside for other opportunities. So when talking about episcopacy and power in the 16th century, I think there are 3 main features that we should consider before starting this debate. We all know, or at least some of us know, that in the 16th century, both Iberian crowns became able to control the appointment of bishops in their territory. This was true in the Portuguese case from 1454 for the overseas territory, and from 1503 in the kingdom, although de facto, not de jure. I can explain this difference later. And in Castile, or in the Spanish crown, this was also true from 1486 for the overseas territories, and since 1523 for the dioceses in the kingdom, shortly after the French crown had received the same right. Now, this meant that bishops' appointments were among the many nominations that the monarchies had at their disposal to promote relations of fidelity with their subjects. And they were actually one of the most desired nominations as a result of their symbolic, economic, and political power, as well as the possibility of progression to those who were appointed to an initial bishopric. The second factor is related to the Council of Trent, that looked to bishops as the key elements for the reform of the church. These new bishops that looked to have a more direct intervention on their territories were met with great resistance by local powers. And this was true in Europe with the cathedral chapters mainly, but also in the overseas territories with the religious orders that both sought to keep the control they had before the arrival of these new bishops. The third reason is related to confessionalization of the Iberian monarchies. As we know, the most attentive pastoral care and the better cultural preparation of these individuals created the ground for new forms of religious activity. Pastoral visits, foundation of seminars, sermons, public celebrations, and the persecution of deviatory behaviors all became important tools in the mission to achieve the conversion of populations. And in times of confessional states, religious language had real political implications, and both spheres supported each other to make their presence more effective locally. Now, it was in this context that the reform in the Iberian territories, as well as in Asia, took place. The most often argument, as I said, was that the territory was too large for only one bishop. And looking to the Iberian territories and leaving Portugal aside for a moment, the other territories under the dominion of the Hispanic crown went in the 16th century from 47 bishoprics to 55 in the end of the century. And I've surrounded them with green circles so that you can spot them. In the Portuguese case, there were created 4 new bishoprics, and I can name them: Leiria, Miranda, Porto Alegre, and Elvas. Portugal went from 9 to 13 dioceses in this century. It was, however, outside Europe that the biggest transformations took place. This process was started by Portugal in the 15th century, when the first bishopric was erected in African territory, starting with Ceuta in 1420. The apparent territorial success of Portugal in Africa was quickly suppressed by the dimension of the territorial conquest in North and South America in the Spanish Empire. In 1546, there were already 16 bishoprics and 3 archbishoprics in the Spanish Empire, against 8 bishoprics and 1 archbishopric in the Portuguese one. In 600, there were 35 bishoprics in the Spanish Padroado. 4 of them were metropolitan dioceses, and 15 under the Portuguese Padroado. 1 of them was metropolitan diocese. Between 1600 and 1700, 7 more dioceses were created in the Portuguese Padroado and 10 under the Spanish Padroado. So I think that so far it has become clear that the foundation of a new diocese shared some common characteristics between Europe and Asia. Never in the history of the Iberian churches were so many dioceses founded in such a short period of time and with such geographical ambitions and future implications. In this process, the role played by John III, the Portuguese king, and Philip II was particularly notorious, as they were the promoters of most of these foundations, or an important part of these foundations, and they did it in the context of a wider reforms that were taking place. What are the key elements to understand the differences between the number of bishoprics in both empires? As a first point of observation, it is useful to maybe look at the size of the Iberian bishoprics, just to have a notion of comparability. The largest bishopric in the Iberian Peninsula was Toledo, with no more than 50,000 square kilometers. Having between 20,000 square kilometers and 29,000, there were 4 Hispanic bishoprics and only 1 Portuguese, Évora, the largest. On the other hand, it should also be noticed that the smaller bishoprics were also mostly in Spain. Portugal had 1 very small bishopric. It was Porto in the north. Having these geographic notions in mind, when looking to Southeast Asia, the differences are obvious. Starting with the Philippines, it is known that when the Bishopric of Manila was founded in 1579, some had already defended the need to create 1 archbishopric instead, replicating the model of Mexico. Despite of that, at that time, only the Diocese of Manila was founded, having all the archipelago under its jurisdiction. The personal insistence of Don Domingo de Salazar in Madrid, after he left the Philippines in 1591, was a key element for the creation of 3 new bishoprics in the islands in 1595. And now, using the limits suggested by Isacio Rodriguez for each bishopric in its chapter Organización de la Iglesia, in the book Historia de la Iglesia en Hispanoaméricas y Filipinas, it is possible to create a map and to try to project these limits between each of the four bishoprics. And this is my suggestion of interpretation. In the Filipino case, just as a matter of comparability, each bishopric had an average of 75,000 square kilometers under its jurisdiction of land. It should be noticed, however, that the Filipino territory is divided in more than 7,000 islands with abundant linguistic and cultural diversity, features that had huge impact on the ability for spatial penetration and on interaction kept between colonial structures and local people. It is, although in the Portuguese case, that the differences between European and Asiatic territories become resounding. Historiography usually chooses to represent the limits of the bishoprics in the Portuguese Padroado as lines near the coastal area. And the example of the map of Oliva Oliveira Marques and João José Alves Dias, it's a good one. You can see it here. Although this option reflects more clearly the lack of the Portuguese authorities to penetrate in Asiatic territories, it does not reflect the territorial ambitions of the Portuguese crown in the 16th century. And following closely Giuseppe Marcocci in a recent paper about the Iberian empires, the author shows that in the Portuguese Empire, there were strong territorial ambitions in Asia, at least until the last decades of this century. And the same author points 5 reasons for the different outcomes in both empires. And they are: 1, the opportunities found locally in its territory. The second one is the possibility for exploring conflicts to their own advantage. The third one is the efficacy of the resistance conducted by local populations. The fourth one is the level of circulation of people and ideas. And the fifth one is the privileges considered to local populations. In fact, the papal bulls of the establishment of a diocese consecrated an area that should be under the jurisdiction of the new bishop and his successors. Even if unrealistic, as they weren't innocuous. From the second decade of the 17th century, when the notion of mare clausum was being strongly debated in Europe, the limits defined on these documents became the argument for a long debate that involved Lisbon, Rome, and Madrid, and later Paris as well. Having this in mind, and using mostly the papal bulls for the establishment of each diocese, as well as the ad limina visits sent from each bishop to Rome in every 5 minutes, it becomes possible to draw a map that I would call a map of virtual jurisdiction of both padroados in Southeast Asia. It is useful to mention that religious frontiers were not exactly the same as economic or military ones. Japan is a great example of that. Being a territory that was always disputed by Macau and Malacca and the Philippines in Southeast Asia, and Lisbon, Madrid, and Rome, in terms of ecclesiastical access and jurisdiction, it was initially claimed by the Portuguese Padroado with the creation of the Bishopric of Macau in 1576. In 1588, the first and only bishopric was founded there, and not much later, the dominant position in the court in Madrid was that Japan should be transferred from the Portuguese to the Castilian Padroado. Amidst the fight between both crowns, when both were under the same king, Rome actually sent a bishop to Japan that arrived unexpectedly in Goa in 1641. Still in 1668, the King of Portugal, Pedro II, defended the right of the Portuguese crown to appoint a bishop to Japan. None of these European powers had ever any real political or military institutional presence there, at least a solid one. Therefore, it can be said that in terms of territorialization, the creation of a bishopric was sort of more elastic than the other structures. It could be the result of a process of consolidation on a broader context of territorialization that was already taking place. This was the case of Goa or Manila, where some institutions were already implemented and where the foundation of a new bishopric and or a new archbishopric was part of the creation of what we can call two new capitals in Asia. But it could also be the result of a project of future occupation and conquest. And this was the case of Japan and Macau in relation to China. Even when these occupations never took place, as they couldn't, given the differences in power, they never ceased to be defended in Europe, or at least to be considered. Aiming to conclude, this map indicates two other major features that I would like to point out. The first one is that the dimension of the dioceses in the Philippines were actually much smaller than the bishoprics of the Portuguese Padroado in Asia, despite of their large dimensions. I'm not saying that they are somehow acceptable or possible to govern with such large portions of territory. Could it be said that the fact that Portugal had less bishoprics in the kingdom had a direct influence on the number of dioceses that were created in Asia? I don't think that this is the case. And I do believe that the framework established by Giuseppe Marcocci is a good guide to understand the different outcomes. Although I know and I'm aware of the dangers of counterfactual history, it is even possible to argue that if the Portuguese were able to penetrate in the interior in some of these territories, as they expected to, similar multiplication should have taken place. To see how effective the multiplication of bishoprics in the 16th century was in terms of institutional consolidation, it may be useful to observe the evolution of this institutional presence in longer chronologies. Oh, this was actually the wider map, just because I find it very interesting to be able to compare in the same map Asia and to Europe and Portugal and Spain kind of closer together to see how huge these differences are. Now this table. And to conclude, can we say that the bishoprics network, that the bishoprics map was part of a territorialization process in the 16th century? I do believe that the answer is yes. And the most convincing argument is how relevant they were in the diplomatic debates that took place in Europe for more than 2 centuries. It remained outside the scope of this paper to analyze simultaneously the diocese's institutional evolution with other forms of jurisdiction, especially the judicial and the political or military ones. How they complemented one another, the factors that made them expand and contract, how they behaved when together in the same territories, and how the individuals and the action performances evolved when they were more isolated. Those are topics that remain to be answered in future projects, I hope. And I do believe that this will bring or shed light in understanding the institutional development of imperial structures in Europe and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your presentation. Now we'll proceed to our third speaker for this part. Our speaker is Joaquin Jose Marie C. Sumpayco III, S.J. He is a Jesuit priest from the Philippine province of the Society of Jesus. He completed his basic and higher education at the Ateneo de Manila University. He has 2 bachelor's degrees from the Ateneo de Manila, the first in development studies and the second in sacred theology. His 2 master's degrees are also from the Ateneo de Manila University, one in philosophy and another in theology. He is a licensed professional educator in the Philippines. He also is a Doctor of Education in Catholic Educational Leadership from the University of San Francisco in California, USA. His interest as a Jesuit educator stems from being a 4th-generation educator and a 3rd-generation Jesuit. This interest became more evident when he read the memoir of his great-grandfather, who graduated from the Jesuit-run Escuela Normal de Maestros during the time of the Spanish colonization. His entry to the Jesuit order and eventual assignment as school principal at Xavier University, Ateneo de Cagayan, brought about a deep desire to tell the stories of the Philippine Jesuit schools of education and see how they have been and continue to be heroic institutions of learning, leadership, transformation, and liberation in mission. He currently serves as Vice President for Basic Education at the Ateneo de Manila University. His presentation is entitled Philippine Jesuit Schools of Education, Heroic Institutions of Learning, Leadership, and Mission. Father John G., you have the floor.
In 1773, the Jesuits ceased to become a Catholic religious order. Pressured by the royal courts of Portugal, France, and Spain, Pope Clement XIV had suppressed the Society of Jesus. Jesuits throughout the world renounced their vows and were driven into exile. The suppression lasted until 1814, when Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus. When the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, the education network of some 800 institutions had already become one of the most widespread international operations of its time. The Jesuits were only able to return to the Philippines in 1859 on the condition that they would not try to recover any of the property confiscated by the government during their expulsion. Their primary mission was to be sent to the southern island of Mindanao. However, upon their return, the City Council of Manila requested the Jesuits to take charge of the municipal school. By 1865, the colonial government also asked the Jesuits to establish a normal school under its direction. During the normal school existence, from 1865 to 1905, the school was able to produce teachers who were sent to the different parts of the archipelago to establish town schools. With the support of both the church and the state, the mission proved to be a worthwhile endeavor, as more Filipinos were able to be trained on the rudiments of education at the time. The Spanish authorities were able to see the role that the school contributed in the enterprise of education. On the flip side, they were also challenged that by its existence, the Escuela Normal was also producing an intelligentsia that would prove to be important to the Philippine Revolution of 1896. Though there were primary schools already present in some Philippine towns that taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion, a school for the training of teachers was still not in place. The Jesuit-run Escuela Normal de Maestros was one of the first schools of education founded in Asia. Established under the Spanish Royal Decree of 20 December 1863, it became the center of the public school system in the Philippines until its closing shortly after the arrival of the new American colonizers in 1898. A vacuum in the training of teachers under Jesuit mentorship was experienced until the Jesuits established schools of education under separate colleges called Ateneos, decades after. It was only then that when the Jesuits began to return to the educational ministry of teacher education they once had. In the past, the Escuela Normal de Maestros was a peripheral endeavor as it was new. It was a risk that the Jesuits took as it gave future Filipino educators the capacity to think and communicate with the Spanish colonizers as equals. Furthermore, the Escuela Normal also produced teachers who were farmed out across the archipelago and taught in primary schools in each town. The idea of creating a normal school to train teachers was new in education. The need for a normal school stemmed from the necessity to train more teachers as new laws were made that required compulsory primary instruction. The normal school was answering the need of the times and bringing them to the context of the Philippines. The director of the Escuela Normal shared his thoughts about this endeavor when he said, "It was useless to ask why it was not thought before 1863 to establish a normal school in Manila. Those who have dedicated themselves to the study of the development of education in the peninsula do not ignore that not only in Spain, but not even in Europe, it was not taught until the present century to regularize the primary instruction of such faith. The teachers were formed in certain schools. Hakas described the advantages that were experienced by the various sectors of government upon the foundation of the normal school, despite the effort and cost of running the school. The immediate fruits of this foundation are the greater ease of communication between the indigenous people and the civil, military, and ecclesiastical, governmental, judicial, and administrative authorities, and the greatest development in the arts and industries, in the career of letters and sciences, and the exercise of authority and other subordinate positions in the various offices of the state. The Escuela Normal was able to attract its first 50 students from different parts of the Philippines. The Decreto del Gobierno Superior of 1864 lists the first 50 students of the normal school to have come from the following places. Pacaso explains that this quota was given to the provinces according to the population. The number of students remained constant throughout the years. Pacaso also presents the total number of graduates of the Escuela Normal. The graduates were eventually called maestros, and after their years of service, were considered as principales of their towns. These maestros became resident leaders of their towns. They were in the front line of student engagement during their times. These maestros were also at the front line of everyday living as they were immersed in the towns all over the Philippines. Arcilla notes the role of the normal school graduates beyond their teaching responsibilities. They formed the new elite, the leaders, the link between the authorities and the ordinary families. In almost all cases, the teacher was the only one in town besides the Spanish or Filipino priest who spoke, read, and wrote Spanish. By the time of the Bonifacio uprising in 1896, many of the teachers had emerged as the local leaders and propagandists for a free Philippines. Meany shares a tribute written by a Filipino historian in 1932. The establishment of the normal school during the Spanish regime made the noble profession that is considered today in the Philippines. The graduates of the school, wherever they served, were highly respected and honored citizens. The countless contemporary articles portraying the miserable life of public school teachers were not meant to cast direct discredit upon the teachers themselves, but rather to call attention to the inadequacy of their compensation and material equipment. The salutary influence which was exerted by these teachers is recognized and felt by their contemporaries. Differing from the physical location of the Escuela Normal, the present Philippine Jesuit schools of education are located mostly outside the Philippine capital of Manila. Despite being present in the physical peripheries of the country, these modern-day Jesuit schools of education have also been recognized by the Philippine Commission of Higher Education to be centers of excellence and centers of development in the field of teacher education. Ateneo de Naga University is in the southernmost part of the island of Luzon, where it faces the Pacific Ocean. It lies in a typhoon-prone area, making the region an area of constant rebuilding. The population is considered as one of the economically poorer areas of the Philippines. Ateneo de Davao University, Xavier University, Ateneo de Cagayan, Ateneo de Zamboanga University are located on the southernmost island of Mindanao. Though the island is rich in natural resources, Mindanao has also been described as having a great disparity in the distribution of its wealth. Mindanao lies in a region torn by conflict that can be traced back to centuries past. The locations of these schools are also near the three largest groups of Muslim nations in the area. Cagayan is close to the Maranaos. Davao is close to Maguindanaoans. Zamboanga is close to the Tausuks. Amidst the conflict-laden area, peace building and dialogue also thrive in the southernmost island. The three Mindanao-based schools are torn by conflict and can be traced back to this diverse location. These four present-day Philippine Jesuit schools of education have stories to share that brand them as excellent in the work they engage in. Looking into the list of the 2018 university rankings of the Philippines, the area of excellence in teacher training is what Philippine Jesuit universities have in common. These schools of education have been of much influence in the formation of Philippine youth. They have allowed the younger generation to actively and courageously take part in nation building and lead a new generation of learners to search, imagine, and define what it means to work for a free Philippine nation. The theme of generativity, or handing over the school's mission, is celebrated in the Philippine Jesuit schools. Educators are elated when they find their students becoming their colleagues. Educators also witness the shared humanity at work in their schools of education. There is no one formula on how teaching Jesuit schools are run, as each will have its contexts of time and place to work with. Even with the present-day Philippine Jesuit schools of education, they had to figure out what was needed in their contexts. The different Jesuit universities in Cagayan de Oro, Davao, Naga, and Zamboanga saw the need to introduce the practice or training its teachers to continue the original Jesuit mission of saving souls. To rediscover the work of forming educators, the Jesuits assigned to the Philippines in the mid-1900s revived the endeavor of teaching schools in their universities by looking to the wellspring of resources that would make reinventing these schools possible. In the study I made, two main resources emerged, wherein the reestablishment of the mission has drawn its inspiration from faith and culture. Spirituality and values have shown much influence in the focus group discussions of all Philippine Jesuit schools of education. This describes much of how the faith formation aspect of the schools has been sustained and improved. Generations, belonging, gratitude, and sacrifice have all defined the journeys of the people who are involved in the experience of these schools. This describes much of the cultural traits of the educators who continue to be present and propagate the mission of the schools. It is in this light that the study I made brings in some points to consider, as it has provided a three-tiered assessment of the Philippine Jesuit schools of education. For persons, spirituality and values have always been part of the Jesuit mission of the Philippine Jesuit schools of education. What was lost from the Escuela Normal was the formation of the affective aspect of educators. The contextual holistic formation brought about the heart in teacher formation. It goes beyond the job descriptions of one's work. Forming future teachers will mean that students will have to witness their professors live out the teachings that they share. It will mean that there will be a continued guidance for both leadership and stakeholders so that such a school may live and prosper. Remember the past. The Escuela Normal de Maestros had the unique position of bridging the church and government. A school that is being planned may have to purposely consider that it is both in the service of faith and in the service of the nation. One cannot be separated from another. Learn from the periphery. The Ateneos in Cagayan de Oro, Davao, Naga, and Zamboanga have long continued the work of the Escuela Normal de Maestros. They have struggled to define the teaching curriculum in their respective Philippine Jesuit universities. Re-establishing a school of education in Manila is an opportunity for the Philippine Jesuit schools of education to collaborate and synergize their efforts. It may be able to provide a better opportunity to share best practices or even share resources and personnel, improving the conditions of teaching in the Philippines. It is an endeavor worth to be considered, but most of all, to be discerned and planned well, so as not to lose sight of the mission at hand. Weaving the story of the past to the present gives a better appreciation of how Jesuit pedagogy has contributed to the flourishing of a transformative and revolutionary spirit that transcends Philippine education. The full text of this study may be accessed through this link.
Okay, thank you very much, Father John G. Okay, we will now go to the open forum part of our event. For the Q&A, we will entertain questions from three audiences here in the Zoom room, from the YouTube comment section, and from Facebook. Our community managers, led by Dr. Noel Rodriguez, will monitor those channels and relay questions to us. I invite our viewers to please type your questions, and we'll gather them and read them out for you later. Okay. Do you have questions? Does anyone have any questions? At least here among those people that are present here in the Zoom room. Okay, if there are no questions, I have a few questions here which were sent to me. So first question is, first two questions are to Elsa. The first one is, in your cover slide, you have a map. So the question is, what is that map in your cover slide? And second, can we know again of Filipinos who were part of the House of Mercy and their involvement in it? So two questions for Elsa. The map in your cover slide, what is all about, what is it? And then can we know of Filipinos who are part of the House of Mercy and their involvement in it? Elsa?
Thank you very much. Please apologize. I need the help from Paulo Pinto or Kevin.
Okay.
We translate the question, please. Kevin, can you help me, please?
Sure, I can. But yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I don't understand the question of Professor Ruben Mendonça, please. Just the beginning.
Can
you repeat, Professor?
Okay. In your presentation, the first slide,
yes,
you have
yes.
a map. So the question is, what is the map about? What is it? No, what is the map?
Sorry,
Sobre o que é o quadro,
a tabela. Ok.
O mapa na sua apresentação, o primeiro slide. Aquele mapa que tinha no primeiro slide da sua apresentação.
Ok. Eu vou falar em português, é melhor, e fazem o favor de traduzir, por favor, para não ficar pior. Por favor, é uma representação de Macau, penso que datada de 1640, 1641. E encontra-se, pertence à Biblioteca da Ajuda.
Okay. It is a representation of Macau from 1640, 1641, and it is in Lisbon, in Biblioteca da Ajuda, in Ajuda. And the other question was, sorry?
Okay, the other question is, can we know of Filipinos who are part of the House of Mercy and their involvement in it? Filipinos who are part of the House of Mercy and their involvement in it.
Elsa, filipinos que tenham sido parte da Misericórdia de Macau e que envolvimento é que tiveram na Misericórdia de Macau?
Sim, não. Nunca não encontrei, é muito difícil, na verdade, eu para além, desculpe, Kevin, para além da referência a Madre Marta de São Bernardino, eu só encontrei uma vez uma referência a um filipino e pertencia à tripulação da chamada Embaixada Mártir de 1640. Embora nós saibamos que da população flutuante de Macau faziam parte filipinos. Para ser honesta e rigorosa, é só isto que eu posso dizer. Muito obrigada.
So besides Madre Marta de São Bernardino that Elsa presented in her paper, Elsa only found one Filipino, reference to one Filipino in her documentation, and that was one Filipino that was part of what we know as the Martyr Embassy of 1640. Although we know that in the population of Macau there were different groups, and surely there were Filipinos there, but Elsa didn't find explicit references to them.
I need to tell another thing, please. Kevin, please. Os chineses integraram a Misericórdia de Macau. Certamente após 1627 e antes de 1640. Nós sabemos isto por uma instrução real de 1644. Mas de filipinos, até hoje, eu já percorri muitas fontes, nunca encontrei outras informações para além daquelas que eu dei agora.
Okay. So to complement this information, Elsa is saying that from an instruction, a royal instruction of 1644, we know that Chinese were part of the Holy House of Mercy from 1627 to 1640. And so this is just one more element in this debate. And I think that was all. I hope I did justice to the...
Thank you very much. Thank you. And sorry, please.
No problem. Thank you, Elsa, for your answers, and Kevin for the translation. I have here a question for you, Kevin. So the question is, what are the implications of the division of the bishoprics in Southeast Asia to the local papules? Again, I repeat, what are the implications of the division of bishoprics in Southeast Asia to the local papules?
Okay. The more dense the bishoprics are, the more authority they can exert locally. So if one territory is a large territory, only has one bishopric, we can be sure that the bishop will only go to certain populations from, I don't know, each 5 years. Sometimes there will be populations that will not see a bishop for a decade. There are certain roles that only a bishop can perform, like to confirm and to ordain priests. The segregation of churches is also usually a role that is reserved to bishops. So one can say that there is an effective practical role, but other than that, there's also a symbolic role of the bishop as the pastor, and especially as a pastor of the Trent Church. So bishops have a specific role in societies, and looking to descriptions of bishops' visits or bishop sermons, it is very visible, this impact that the episcopal presence had locally. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Yes, Father Tony, you raise your hand, your question or comment.
Yes, thank you to the speakers, to all three speakers. I think they open up new areas for research. But I'd like to pose two questions, first to Kevin and then to Jonji. To Kevin, perhaps if you can try to explain a little bit the Padroado, okay, as a kind of a system that governed church-state relations in Portugal, in the colonies. And do you see any differences, perhaps, between the Portuguese Padroado and the Spanish Padroado? The Patronato Real de la Iglesia de las Indias, because it's a fascinating topic, this whole question of the Padroado, because in Portugal, for example, it seems continued to claim Padroado rights all the way into the middle of the 20th century. So this agreement, because basically it's a kind of agreement between the monarchs of Portugal, the monarchs of Spain, with the Holy See, right, governing church-state relations. So, but principally perhaps in the appointment of bishops, that was certainly the most important component. So if you can, and then of course the Propaganda Fide was an attempt by the Holy See, as it were, to try to regain, to some extent, some kind of control over the missions in Asia, since not all parts of Asia were under the Portuguese or under the Spaniards. So perhaps if you have something to say about that a little bit more. Then second, to Jonji, the question is about the Escuela Normal. And there were two kinds, right? There was the Instrucción Primaria, so primary education, but then there was also Instrucción Secundaria. So, I don't know whether you have anything to add to what you said about the Escuela Normal. It started off precisely with training teachers for primary education, but then at some point, the Escuela Normal of the Jesuits was raised to the status of an Escuela Normal de Instrucción Secundaria, diba? No, and then I don't know whether you have anything to share about the Escuela Normal that the Assumption Sisters in the Philippines actually started for the schools for girls. Okay? So there was, in fact, an attempt to try to train teachers for girls' schools, no? For girls' schools. So I don't know whether you would have anything to add to what you said. So I guess first Kevin and then Jonji.
Kevin?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. The Padroado, briefly, is a system that was gradually implemented in the 15th and the first half of the 16th century, and that is characterized by the transfer of both obligations or duties as well as rights in terms of religious administration of what we call imperial territories. So in very basic terms, the Holy See transferred the right to collect certain taxes and ecclesiastic taxes. I'm not sure if taxes is the right word in English, but do forgive me the language, please. But also transferred the obligation to found and erect churches, to sustain missionaries, and to guarantee the missionary activity, so the conversion of populations that were being known from the Europe's perspective. Now, what happened was that from the mid-16th century, we noticed that Rome starts having a new interest in these territories and starts trying to get back some of the privileges that it had transferred before knowing exactly what was about to take place in the centuries ahead. And the Propaganda Fide is indeed a good sign of this. The Propaganda Fide is the institution that is going to sort of take charge on the trying to call Rome or to put Rome in the center of the missionary efforts. And it is very curious. I quoted Pedro II, the king that in that tries to appoint bishops to Japan. The ambassador of Portugal in Rome wrote to the viceroy in Goa saying that it was propaganda fide that was keeping the appointment of bishops from being done, because propaganda fide thought that Portugal only had right to appoint bishops to Goa and to Macau, because they considered that they were the only two cities where Portugal had effective political domain. About the comparison between both padroados, this is indeed a very dense topic. And a very interesting one. I would point out only one, and it seems that the missionaries of the Spanish Empire had more privileges than the Portuguese one. So my supervisor believes that the known Omnimoda document that gave the friars much autonomy in relation to episcopal jurisdiction is something that is very specific of the Spanish Empire. I'm not so actually convinced of that, because I think ideas circulate a lot and they try to always kind of appropriate from the better ideas to themselves. Institutions do that, but this is one that I would like to point out and that I would like to explore in the future. And I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Father John G.
I feel a little bit nervous right now because my former teachers are now here, Father and Ma'am Noel. But anyway, let me try to answer that for Elsa and Kevin. Muito obrigado, colegas. You now follow Portuguese, so I'll answer in English. So, so what we're going to have, as Father Tony mentioned, that the Escuela Normal really started that Escuela Normal for primary instruction, and that was given for grade school. But sooner or later, they saw the need to move towards secondary education so that it would be furthering education in the Philippines. Common education for everybody was new in the 1860s. But in the 1870s, they saw a need to move forward, and surprisingly, the school that was able to be the first one in these secondary instructions, or to be called Escuela Normal Superior, was that of the nuns in Camarines in Naga, Colegio de Santa Isabel. Now, under the Vincentian or the DCs, they are the first ones for that. In fact, in terms of secondary education, the Jesuits were a little bit like copycats in a sense. But people were really jostling for that position to be able to have that secondary license of teaching, training teachers, so that education will also expand in the archipelago. But more than the archipelago, it was also shared across Southeast Asia, as the mission was also open to the people from the Marianas, and at the same time, as we are trying to look at it, the people who are sent as missionaries also carry this work of educating. I am very much grateful for this, because I am able to see where the work of education has its roots in the Philippines. And we're a little bit lucky because it's not that far, 1860s. And if we're going to do our work and do our work looking into the books and history, we will be able to find more things. If it were centuries before, then it would be a little bit harder. I hope I answered your question, Father Tony.
Yes, you did. But of course, Georgie, right? The Escuela Normal had to go out of existence when the American colonial government came in, and when they set up their own Philippine Normal School. No, actually, I think, I don't know whether you were able to note this, but the American colonial government actually offered to support the Jesuit Escuela Normal. But because the Jesuits insisted that they should teach religion, then the American colonial officials then said that we cannot do that, right? We cannot support an institution that teaches a particular religion, because at that time, the whole question of the separation of church and state, of course, was already resolved, right? There has to be some kind of a separation there. So, did you come across that bit of information?
In the larger study, I put it there, but since we're limiting the sharing into 15 minutes, so we have to give the
That's right.
succinct points that are there. But I really came out with that. I also pointed out what was lost in teacher education when that policy came in. And we were taught to be citizens. And my proposal at the end of the study would be try to get back that heart which was lost. Because we were being tried to form in the same mold, to follow the same things all over again, and anything that does not go into that standard will not be counted as excellent. But prior to that, when we would have a, a whole perspective of not talking about church and state, but talking about the spiritual, talking about the intellectual, talking about the action that a person will be taking as one is being formed in the education aspect, then that holistic approach is now being looked into as a need in our present day Philippine schools. So to retrieve that, maybe we need to go back to history and see how it was before this concept of separating what is the churches or what is the states would be brought into conversation. The thing that I'm trying to talk about is let's regain the humanity, because in appreciating that, we are also able to see a bigger picture that might make more sense.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Father Tony and Father John G. The last question actually is also for you, Father John G. This came in earlier. What would be unique to the Jesuit schools that you mentioned, since, for instance, the heroism that you talk about can also be said of other schools by other religious congregations? So what would be distinctive about Jesuit education and their contribution to Philippine society?
That's a tough one. I really feel that I'm taking an oral exams right now. And what I'm probably it's the continuity. It's the continuity that the work of education, though not designed for Jesuits, really came into the mission. I believe that Kevin is in Coimbra, and Coimbra was a place where the Jesuits started with their education, and they saw that there's a need to train people. But this is to train the trainers, train teachers. So it was a need for the Philippines during the 1860s. It was the need for the ultramar, the Spanish crown, to show that the islands outside of Spain was also progressive in a sense. And the Jesuits were the first ones to say yes to that act of training teachers. Oftentimes we would look into the Escuela Municipal as the Jesuit school in Manila, but actually before the 1900s there were two schools, and the two schools were that of the students and that of the teachers. And if you can see how that contributes to generation, how that contributes to a bigger mission by training trainers, that spells a lot of difference as we speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Father John Chi. This is all the time we have for our open forum. We will have another open forum event later on after the second part of this particular panel. Now we'll proceed to part 2 of this panel. Okay, for the second part of this panel, we will have two presentations. The first presentation is by Father Jose Elias Manalastas, or Father Anson, OSB. He is a Benedictine monk of the Abbey of Our Lady of Montserrat in Manila. He holds a PhD in history from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His areas of interest are cultural and historical developments in Philippine cuisine and Philippine-Mexican exchange in the age of the Manila Galleons. He is currently teaching at the College of Law at San Beda University. So his presentation is entitled De Barcelona a Manila, 125 Years, hence Benedictine missions as fruit of Benedictine Jesuit cooperation. Father Anselm, you have the floor.
Father Anselm, I think you are muted. Can you please repeat again? We couldn't hear you earlier.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by saying that this particular talk is in honor of our Holy Father, Saint Benedict, and Saint Ignatius of Loyola, whose feast we will celebrate later on this month. My paper is De Barcelona a Manila, 125 years hence, Benedictine missions as fruit of Benedictine Jesuit collaboration. 126 years ago, on September 12, 1895, 14 Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Our Lady of Montserrat in Spain landed on Philippine soil. The coming of the Benedictine monks to the Philippines was a determined solution to a lingering problem then in Spain, because in the 1800s, the situation of the Benedictine order in Spain during that time was anything but encouraging, for there were only aging monks and nuns inhabiting ancient monasteries. Now, vocations to the monastic life in Spain was really in a dismal state, because young people chose to join the mob that called for the abrogation of the religious houses instead of entering as postulants or beginners to the religious life. There was this anti-clerical sentiment then prevalent in Spain during that time. That's why in the 1860s, Bishop Rosendo Salvado, a Benedictine bishop from Puerto Victoria in Australia, visited Spain, and he saw the pitiable state of the monasteries there. And after consulting friends and ecclesiastics, it became very clear to Bishop Salvado that the only way by which the order could survive those challenging times was for the Benedictines to establish a missionary endeavor to the ultramar, because that was the only way by which the government would allow the monasteries to accept monks. He named the colegio El Colegio de Misioneros de Ultramar, the College for Missionaries Beyond the Sea. Having received the approval of the Crown in 1865, Bishop Salvado approached the abbot and community of the Benedictine Abbey of Montserrat in Barcelona for the possibility of housing the colegio there. Abbot Miguel Muntadas, although he was by then very sickly, accepted the proposal of Bishop Salvado for the Colegio de Misioneros de Ultramar to be housed in Montserrat. The community of Montserrat also accepted the proposal. Now, in compliance with the royal order, the new abbot of Montserrat, Jose Diaz, went to Madrid on April 28, 1895, in order to seek an audience with the Spanish court regarding the location for the missions. Because up until then, it was not yet decided which areas in the Philippines the Benedictines could conduct missionary endeavors. Because we would remember that by then, majority of the Philippines was already subdivided among the religious orders who were already here. In a gathering of the superiors of the religious orders, what was then called the Besamanos, Abbot Diaz approached Father Joaquin Sancho, the procurator of the Jesuits, who informed him that the Jesuits were in the process of relinquishing the missions of Surigao in Mindanao Island in the Philippines, and that already, if the abbot would so wish, he could make communications with the Jesuit provincial so that he could inquire on which areas in Mindanao the Benedictines could replace the Jesuits. Within a short period of time, therefore, because they have identified places already where the Benedictines could work as missionaries, the Benedictines drafted an agreement with the Jesuits for the transfer of their Surigao missions. And Abbot Diaz signed the agreement with Father Pablo Pastels, the secretary of the Jesuit province of Aragon. Now, when the Benedictines arrived in the Philippines, on board the Isla de Panay, the Jesuits were the ones who welcomed them to Intramuros. They escorted Abbot Diaz and the monks to the cathedral for the singing of the Te Deum. It is an ancient hymn of thanksgiving, which was it was a tradition that whenever there is a new religious order to work in the Philippines, they would have to proceed to the cathedral for this hymn of thanksgiving. Now, after the liturgical ceremony, the Jesuit fathers prepared refreshment for them at the cathedral chapter hall. The Jesuits were aware that the Benedictines were by then hungry, and therefore they provided refreshment for them. The Jesuits also extended hospitality to the Benedictines at the Ateneo Municipal. I was happy when I heard about the comments of Father Junji regarding the Ateneo de Municipal. Well, the Jesuits of the Ateneo welcomed the new missionaries together with the students and the professors. The missionaries also stayed at the Ateneo for a few days, although some of them would have to later transfer to another place that was determined by the Jesuits, their hosts, for their temporary lodging. But Abbot Diaz, together with his assistant, stayed at the Ateneo. The Jesuits opened the doors of their residence in Santa Ana to the monks, and a number of them stayed there for quite some time, for 7 months or so. In Surigao, the new missionaries, Abbot Diaz and the monks, had at their disposal the help of the Jesuits, Father Ricard, who accompanied them in the reconnoitering of the parishes. It is worth noting that even up to this time, the Benedictines have not yet decided which parishes they would be able to handle and therefore take over from the Jesuits. In the Nagat Island, the monks delighted in the pompous reception of the people. Now, the Jesuits who were in the parishes were very gracious in welcoming the new missionaries, together with children who were holding banderitas,
biglang humingi ng
banners
sukli. Sa umpisa,
in their
20
hands
pesos.
to welcome
Bibigyan ko na sana, 20 lang. Eh, iniba niya, naging 50. Eh, nagkataon wala naman akong
Throughout
dalang
their
50.
visitation of
Pinakita
the
ko sa kanya,
parishes,
ginanong ko. Paano naging 50 yung
they
pera
would
mo?
take over.
Tapos yung
Abbot
mga
Diaz
pasahero,
and the monks
sumagot na.
found comfort in the happy and fruitful
Wala kaming
experiences
inabot.
that they had with the
Lalong
people.
nag-init ang ulo ng babae.
The Jesuit pastors led the parishioners and all the civil officials
Saglit
in
na
welcoming
nakahimik
the
ang
new
babae.
missionaries,
Pero
warmly receiving them through the pealing of bells,
sinabunutan
the
ng
lighting of
babae ang
fireworks,
pasahero
the
estudyante.
playing of the town bands, delivering kind speeches, and tendering amusement in the form of dances and music. Now, this particular quotation is from one of the accounts of Abbot Diaz, and this happened in the Dapa, where the monks arrived at 3 a.m. and the Jesuit pastor, together with the parishioners, welcomed them, even if it was too early, but they welcomed them with all of these fanfare. The Jesuits, therefore, and I would like to say, led the Filipino parishioners to roll out for the Benedictines Filipino hospitality at its best. Also, the Jesuits assisted the monks who were to succeed them in the parishes of Surigao, together with the parishioners. Initially, they chose 4 parishes, but they ended up with like they welcomed parishes. All of these fanfare. Well, included the Jesuits parishes. Therefore, were the parishes of Surigao, Higakit, to say, led the Filipino parishioners to roll out for the Benedictines, Dapa, Filipino hospitality, Numancia, and Cantilan, of course. The Jesuits assisted the Benedictines, the monks who were to succeed, providing sound advice for them. Especially initially, they chose 4 important matters parishes confronting them. Ended up with like they welcomed them with all of these fanfare. Well, included the case in point. Therefore, there's the proposal for the San Ramon Penal Colony. There was this proposal from the then Governor General Ramon Blanco for the Benedictines to assume the administration of the San Ramon Penal Colony in Zamboanga, providing sound advice. Governor General Blanco put up this penal colony when he was governor of Zamboanga. Now, Abbot Diaz, therefore, thought of asking the Jesuits about there was this insights from the then Governor and the Jesuits, Ramon Blanco, including the Benedictines of the Ateneo, suggested that the administration should take some of his monks, they should go to some Governor General, see for themselves whether or not this proposal would be feasible and sustainable. Abbot Diaz, of course, fell in love with the place. It was a huge tract of land, and the penal colony can very well fulfill one of the original reasons why the Benedictines were supposed to come over to the Philippines, because they were supposed to put up agricultural colonies. And the San Ramon Penal Colony would have been one of the ways by which they could fulfill that. However, even if they accepted the proposal, nothing came out of that venture, because by then the Philippine Revolution against Spain was already raging, and Governor Blanco actually finished his tour of duty. The Jesuits were comforting companions to the monks too during the difficult days of the Philippine Revolution against Spain, because they suffered incarceration in Surigao. And the Jesuits, together with the Benedictines, were holed up in the conventos. In conclusion, in celebrating their 126th anniversary, particular quotation that I would like to mention to you, the words of Father Paypok, no, the then rector of the Ateneo Municipal. And I quote, "De momento se instalaron en el Ateneo Municipal de Manila, como entonces se llamaba el Colegio de los Jesuitas. A los pocos días se trasladaron a la casa de campo que los padres de la compañía tienen en Arrabal de Santa Ana." Quotation, y allí that I would habitaron like to 7 meses to you, y hubieron podido habitar 7 años. Según the words el amor Father con que se ofreció, no, the then rector aquel hospedaje Ateneo Municipal. Mas no pore solo los hijos del caballero de Loyola consideraron en el Ateneo Municipal de Manila de gratitud. Como entonces hay deudas de gratitud el colegio de los jesuitas que no se cancelan. A los pocos días se trasladaron a la casa de campo que los padres I would de la like to think that Father Manuel Paypok and the Jesuit fathers were thinking about that time when St. Ignatius Loyola stayed at the Benedictine Abbey of Montserrat, and offered his own sword to the Virgin of Montserrat, consideraron dedication, serving the church. Now, on the part of the Benedictines, the words of Abbot Jose Diaz very well capture the feeling of gratitude. I would like to think that Father Manuel Jesuit, the Jesuit brothers, como podremos pagarles tantas atenciones y tantos gastos? Stayed no lo sé, the Benedictine Abbey, Dios se lo pagará, y nosotros debemos estarles eternamente the Virgin of Montserrat, procurando conservar la buena amistad adquirida y corresponder como podamos a tantos favores. The Benedictine pioneers in the Philippines were able to succeed in their mission thanks to the help of the Jesuit fathers. That in all things, God may be glorified. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Father Ansem, for your presentation. Now we'll proceed to our next speaker. Our next speaker, Father Antonio de Castro, was born in Jolo, Sulu on the 13th of June, 1960. He went through basic education at Notre Dame of Jolo and to the Ateneo de Manila University, where he procured the AB in philosophy. He then entered the Society of Jesus in 1981. He enrolled in some courses on Islam at the Institute of Islamic Studies, University of the Philippines. In 1991, he obtained the degree Bachelor in Sacred Theology, Bachelor in Sacred Theology. Ordained to the priesthood in March 1992, he was granted both the MA in Theology at the Ateneo de Manila University and the Licentiate in Sacred Theology. He was then sent to the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome to do a licentiate and doctorate in church history. He was Associate Professor of Church History at the Loyola School of Theology and for many years taught courses in philosophy, theology, and history at the Ateneo de Manila University. He was series editor of the Mindanao Studies publications of the Ateneo de Manila University Press for some time and has contributed chapters to books such as Theology, Conflict, and Peacebuilding, published in 2019, and Philippine Local Churches After the Spanish Regime, Quae Mari Silico and Beyond, 2015. He has published several articles as well as in journals such as Mandas, the Journal of the Loyola School of Theology, and Philippine Studies. Currently, he is Associate Professor of the School of Liberal Arts, Ateneo de Zamboanga University. His presentation is titled The Filipino Between the Spaniard and the American, Some Historical Considerations in the History of the Jesuits in the Philippines in the First Half of the 20th Century. Father Tony, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Professor Mendoza. I'd like to share my screen and explain how I'd like to go about delivering at least some sections of this paper, because it's a rather huge topic actually. Okay. All right. Okay. The abstract says something about what I'd like to do, but I hope I'll be able to fulfill what it promises. But first, let me present a kind of preliminary bibliographical remark. First of all, here, the general background really has something to do with Philippine history, Philippine church history, but with a particular focus on the history of religious life in the country. Okay? So perhaps we're much more conversant with the history of the priesthood, for example, in the country, particularly the diocesan priesthood. But here, I'd like to focus on the history of religious life in the Philippines. Okay? Second, I kind of take two works as bookends for what I'd like to share with you this afternoon. First of all, there is Father Schumacher's A Golden Age of the Philippine Church, 1700 to 1768, in his last book, which is Growth and Decline, Essays on Philippine Church History, published by the Ateneo de Manila University. And then, of course, there's the work of an article published by Aguilar and C., both of the Ateneo de Manila University History Department, Horacio de la Costa, Foreign Missionaries and the Quest for Philippinization in the Church in the Age of Decolonization, and that was published 3 to 4 years ago. Okay? So I kind of take these two works with Father Schumacher, basically giving us something about religious life during the Spanish period, and then with June Aguilar and Hobie C. talking about the Jesuits in the time around in the 1950s, okay, when the Philippinization movement, as it were, in the church, particularly among the religious orders, became rather pronounced. Then in the in-between, there is, of course, in between these two book-ending works, we have Father Schumacher's A Hispanized Church in an Americanized Country. And then there's the monograph on the history of the Philippinization of a religious order operative during the Spanish regime by Rolando de la Rosa. He wrote, it's the only monograph on the history of a religious order in the Philippines, beginnings of the Filipino Dominicans, history of the Philippinization of the religious orders in the Philippines, initially in 1996, published in 1996 with a second edition in 2014. Also in between would be one work of Father Schumacher, Early Filipino Jesuits, 1593 to 1930, published in Philippine Studies in 1981. Unfortunately, I am in Zamboanga and have no access to the photographs of the Jesuit archives there, so you will forgive me if I'm rather text-bound and don't have many pictures or maps to show you. Okay? So what I'd like to do is first several points to consider as a kind of background. Here, Father Schumacher summarizes the situation toward the end of the 18th century when it came to Filipino, if you say Indio or Mestizo, both Spanish and the Chinese, membership in the religious orders. Okay, so and basically he says it's almost you have a few, but there was really no policy, and I think we have to emphasize the idea of a policy of admitting Filipinos into the religious orders. Okay, and then he talks about the 19th century here as well. Again, basically in the 19th century, perhaps the situation would become even worse because of the political situation in the country, as influenced as well by the political situation in Spain. But here, let me just give you some figures. In 1898, there were approximately 1,152 members of the four mendicant religious orders: the Augustinians, the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinian Recollects. In 5 years, as well, that number would drop again basically 246. Perhaps the situation would be from 1,152 to 246. That's a huge drop. Okay, and I think this was a very, very serious situation for the church in the Philippines. Okay? With regard to the Jesuits, in 1898 there were about 167 Jesuits. By the year 1900, so 2 years after, only 96 Jesuits would remain in the country. I'd like to offer as well as a kind of background the political situation that perhaps should have some bearing on our topic. And here I take this from Abenales and Amoroso. When Francis Burton Harrison took office as Governor General in 1913, there were 2,623 Americans in the Insular Service, with 147 of them in major positions like assistant bureau chief or higher, judges, provincial governors, lieutenant governors, etc. Well, there were only 859 Filipinos in Insular Service holding high office and 1,080 in classified services. So that's in 1913. Abenales and Amoroso say, and here they rely on Gole, by 1919, only 58 Americans were left holding higher offices and 702 in classified services. The proportion of Americans in the colonial state was reduced from 29 to 6% with those in senior positions, dropping from 1/7 to 1/20. And I think here is a kind of, I think, relevant bit of information. Correspondingly, Filipinos in Insular Service holding high office numbered 6,363, and those in classified services had reached 12,047. One of the big questions that come up precisely during this period in Jesuit history in the Philippines is the low numbers of Filipinos entering the Society of Jesus. And Father Schumacher considers it's because of the kind of, he basically looks at the cultural situation. And as his last chapter in his book, Growth and Declines, says, taking it from a quote, he says, what we have in the Philippines in the 20th century, at least all the way up to, in fact, Vatican II, would be a Hispanized clergy or church, you might say, in an Americanized country. So basically, he looks at the process of the Americanization then taking place in the country while the church had remained Hispanized. So the title of my really this essay is The Filipino Between the Spaniard and the American, because well, let me just continue then to offer you some points. So so given that point of the political situation in the 1950s, what we have, and here we get this from June Aguilar and Hobie C. He says, the Philippinization of religious orders, which were composed largely of foreign missionaries and led by them, was intensely disputed. Of the 1,742 religious priests in the Philippines in 1958, 1,555 of them were foreigners, and only 187 or 11% were Filipinos. And nearly half of these 11% would in fact be Jesuits. Okay? Father Schumacher says something about these figures, saying that we should be careful about using these figures because many of these religious congregations that came in the 20th century had only relatively recently arrived. Okay? In any case, okay, it's interesting that the Jesuits were the only one, in fact, that had a deliberate policy of recruiting Filipinos. Okay? So in this paper, what I'd like to do is kind of bring up certain things going back to an earlier time, because this is not something that you find in Father Schumacher, nor is it something that you find in June Aguilar's and Hobie C's article, because they basically started in the 1950s, and Schumacher kind of goes to around the 1930s, but does not quite develop this thing. In 1910, so please take note that what we have here is a Jesuit mission of the province of Aragon. Okay? So when we say, of course, province of Aragon, we need to understand that this covered, in fact, Aragon in Spain, but also Catalonia and Valencia and the Islas Baleares. Okay, so this covered that area of Spain, which I think in the 1850s or 1860s would be separated from Castile. So you would have Castilla, and then you have Aragon. The Philippine mission, when the Jesuits returned in 1859, would be given to the Provincia de Aragon as its mission. And throughout the history of the Provincia de Aragon, one of the things we need to consider with regard to manpower is that at some point, the Provincia de Aragon would also have missions, Jesuit missions in Chile and Argentina. Okay. All right, and the third would be precisely the Philippines. Okay. But in 1910, given the drop in Jesuit manpower, okay, I guess the Jesuits then in Manila, in the Philippines, the Spanish Jesuits had to ask themselves, is it now time for us to set up a novitiate in the Philippines? This is important because novitiate is the first stage of Jesuit formation. Okay? And from there, you would have them developing further studies in the humanities, in philosophy, and in theology, and on to ordination. Okay, so the novitiate is it's the first stage of Jesuit formation. Okay? Now, so this is 1910 when the mission superior, Father Mir, consulted, as it were, Jesuits in Manila and certain areas around, including Baguio, what they thought about opening a Jesuit novitiate in Manila. Okay? And there were two questions that he posed. The first one is basically something about the convenience of setting it up. No? Is it time to set up this house of formation for Filipinos in the Philippines? And here, ultimately, I think if one gathers the answers given to him, so the answers sent to Father Mir would find themselves to Rome, and this is where I found them, in the Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu, in the Roman archives of the Society of Jesus in Rome. And basically, there was general agreement that, yes, it was time to open a novitiate in the Philippines. Okay? Now, the only problem that they noted was that, would we be able then to find the Jesuits who would act as novice master, the socius, and the people who would be living in the same community? This was such an important thing that, in fact, some of the Jesuits would answer that no, they couldn't think of anybody in the Philippine mission of the province of Aragon who could then play that role of the novice master. Okay? This was such an important thing. But at some point, they would be able to find somebody, but there was general agreement that it was time to open a novitiate. So let me just say that this would in fact happen in 1913. Before that, before the revolution, two or probably three Filipino Jesuits. It's not clear, one of them, whether in fact he was a Filipino, but in any case, they would enter the Society of Jesus in Spain, and then again, beginning in, but one would die, one would leave, one was the nephew of the rector then of the Manila Cathedral, a certain Agia, but then this would be interrupted, obviously, because of the revolution, the Filipino-American War, and then, of course, all the difficulties then following on those events. But in 1907, they started accepting some people again into the novitiate in Spain. So, but now the question was whether we should open a novitiate in the Philippines. Okay? So the first question was, is it advisable? And as I said, there was general agreement that yes, this was advisable. Okay, so I think the more interesting point here is the second question. So let me read this section because I think it will be much clearer and much more to the point. Okay. The second question posed by the mission superior was perhaps the more sensitive, critical, and urgent one. After all, whatever the external socio-political conditions of the country, the establishment of a novitiate in the islands depended so much more on whether the Society of Jesus could count on excellent native vocations and assure itself of certain conditions in the Filipino character which would warrant the trust and confidence in the rightness of such a project. Okay? So by and large, actually, the responses were positive. There were, in fact, Filipino young men who had demonstrated great promise and showed the required aptitude for the life and mission of Jesuits. But despite this clear recognition given to Filipino individuals, concerns were nevertheless expressed about the Filipino character itself in general and what was considered to be its major defect, in particular, the whole question of constancy. These were concerns which indeed and in some way could be taken as an informed assessment of Filipino culture itself. The Filipino reflected his culture. This quote-unquote lack of constancy thought to be found in the Filipino character was almost universally admitted by the Jesuits, although it must be said that they saw such a lack in varying degrees of gravity and mitigated by other circumstances, both real and imagined. Their attempts to explain the problem are in themselves quite interesting, for they reveal not only what they thought of the Filipino, but their own presuppositions and assumptions. Okay? So, Father Jose Alfonso, though admitting that constancy depended much, if not totally, on the individual himself, nevertheless thought that this nation stands in the lowest rungs of constancy. So, the Filipino was inconstant. That was a comment made. Okay, so and this would be repeated by several Spanish Jesuits themselves. Okay. Also, other character deficiencies were pointed out. Noted was a much too inordinate attachment to the family, a factor which could have grave consequences for the practice of the vow of poverty, for example. Okay? In particular, the Filipinos' capacity to live and function in the more isolated environments of the missions in Mindanao was thought highly questionable. Assigning the Filipino to such far-flung and isolated mission areas was tantamount to putting him in a situation where all the vows would be put in danger. Okay? Also, here, just moving on, these considerations of character were, of course, motivated by anxieties about the moral and spiritual aptitude of the Filipino. A vigorous character, solidity in principles, constancy, and other moral qualities were all considered a bit wanting. But perhaps equally damning was the judgment that the Filipino was intellectually of an inferior type. But other responses nevertheless said that there were exceptions. Okay? The Jesuits could hardly have been unaware of the quality of the minds of some of their alumni, people like Rizal, with whom Pastels, for example, the mission superior at that time, had engaged in an epistolary debate of sorts when Rizal was in Dapitan. Okay, so of equal interest are attempts by several Jesuits of the mission to find mitigating explanations for the weaknesses attributed to the potential native candidate to the Society of Jesus. As a general principle, it was accepted that constancy in one's vocation and fidelity to the vows were graces given from on high. So here there's an appeal, you might say, to a theological position, a theological reason, meaning to say that vocation is not something that is lived out simply on the basis of one's own strengths, but it is a grace given from on high. Okay? Also, there was no lack of good examples to prove that the Filipinos were capable of constancy in their vocation and of fidelity to the vows. Okay? And here various examples would be given. Okay? Also, the Filipinos who had expressed the desire to be admitted into the society, so by this time, 1910, there were already several of them in formation, had they not been proving themselves equal to the task. Okay, so, and then it seems that although, so you have a kind of mixed judgment here. Deficiencies were noted, okay, but then there was also a certain understanding that in fact the same deficiencies could be seen as well, not just among Filipinos, but also among the Spaniards themselves. So here, deficiencies were not the, you might say, monopoly of one people, but the same deficiencies could be seen in the Spaniards themselves. Okay. All right. The solution kind of was clear to all. Everybody accepted that there was then needed a thorough and judicious screening process of candidates and an environment which would provide and assure a solid formation and a good education for those accepted. Okay, so this was the consultation that took place in 1910. In 1912, I guess there must have been discussions of these points, but in 1912, the provincial himself of Aragon visited Manila. And this time it was much easier to travel between Spain and the Philippines through the Indian Ocean than the Suez Canal by this time, and then of course the Mediterranean. And therefore the Provincial of Aragon, I think this was the first time ever, at least in the Philippine mission of the province of Aragon, that there was a visitation of the provincial. Okay? In any case, he made his much-awaited visitation with the Philippine mission, and there, finally, it was decided to open the novitiate. Okay? The question had shifted from considerations of opportuneness and the suitability of Filipino candidates to that of looking for sources of revenue to support the existence of a novitiate. It seems then that by the end of 1912, 2 years after the consultations had been made, the problem of the Filipino character, whether Filipinos could really live the life, the religious life of Jesuits, okay, that this had become moot and academic. More practical issues had now come to the fore. But Father Barachina, so he was the provincial, decided to apply the revenues from the Jesuit funds in Mindanao for the project. And so, close to a month later, the novitiate was again brought up for discussion, etc. Okay. The formal, so finally, the novitiate would be opened on 13 April 1913 under the patronage of the Sagrada Familia, the Holy Family. With the official approval of the general in hand, Father Barachina then received from Doña Consuelo Rojas, who was to be officially recognized by the Society of Jesus as Fundadora de la Casa de Probación de Manila, the sum of 200,000 pesos to serve as the financial foundation for the formation of Jesuit novices. Okay? So I'll stop here because then, and you had several Jesuits entering the novitiate at this point, okay? But maybe just to mention some of the names, okay? So for example, the novitiate community would at various points during the year be composed of the following people: Emmanuel Malwenda, Maximo Jovellanos, Agapito Santos. Okay, they all entered before the novitiate opened formally, so they were accepted before the opening of the novitiate. And then you have people like Eduardo Aniceto, Emilio Azaraga, Mariano Busque, Pedro Escobar, Federico Paredes, Isaias Soler, and Jose Favis. And this group would be known as the Fundadores, Los Fundadores, okay? 10 novices all in all, okay? Then perhaps I should mention that in 1907, when several entered the Society of Jesus in Spain, you would have people like precisely Manuel Alcantara, who died as a novice in 1909, Francisco Javier Portas, who would become the first Filipino to be ordained a priest in the Society of Jesus, and then Jose Sigion would also enter in 1908, and then in 1910, there was Pablo Carasig and Agustin Llenado. And then finally, in less than a year later, Luis del Rosario, who would become Archbishop of Zamboanga, and Agustin Consunyi, who would, it seems, disappear and die during World War II. Okay. All right. So now, here's the thing. So in 1913 to 1932, the novitiate would exist, but it would exist under Spanish Jesuit oversight. The first big group of American Jesuits would arrive in 1921, and then in 1927, I think 26, 27, the Philippine mission would be transferred from the Provincia de Aragon to the Maryland, New York province. Okay? So the American Jesuits would now take responsibility for the Philippine mission. And one of the, initially, given to the American Jesuits in 1921, there were about 22 of them at the time, would be the Ateneo de Manila and the Colegio Seminario de Vigan. Okay. So, but when finally the Maryland, New York province took over the Philippine mission, for a time, for about 3, 4, 5 years, the novitiate remained in Spanish hands, Spanish Jesuit hands, and also San Jose. So this would become a bone of contention between Spanish Jesuits and American Jesuits. Okay, I will not have time to develop this theme, but somehow it all boiled down to, I guess, which group kind of was faithful to the spirit of Jesuit identity and Jesuit formation, with the Spanish Jesuits identified as being more conservative, more traditional, etc., and with the American Jesuits as, you know, being more progressive and more democratic, etc. Father de la Costa, for example, in his youthful work, The Light Cavalry, he wrote it when he was a scholastic, would characterize Spanish Jesuit, the Spanish Jesuit character as autocratic, while the American Jesuits as democratic. Okay? I have questions about these characterizations, but in any case, the novitiate would be precisely a point where there would be this struggle, as it were, between the two communities. Okay? So, and the topic, what I want to present here, and this is something that is an ongoing kind of work, is that very often in the writings that we have, whether it's Father Schumacher or perhaps even Father Mike Bernard, etc., it's this cultural environment of supposed Hispanized church and a Hispanized clergy and a Hispanized population, and then Americanized society. Okay, so church society, one Hispanized, the other one being Americanized. Okay, maybe what I'd like to say is that I'd like to precisely trouble this characterization. In some ways, I think it's too neat, it's too easy, because somehow in this presentation, the one who disappears is the Filipino himself. So this kind of nag-uumpugang bato, two kind of rocks crashing against each other, kind of caught in between is the one who is supposed to be the one being formed in order to become full members of the Society of Jesus. Let me end by just saying, since I have time is running out, that in the 90s, so the Americans would finally take over formation of Filipino Jesuits in the 1930s. But let me just say that actually by the second half of the 1930s, there were already signs of a kind of proto-nationalist sentiment among certain Filipino Jesuits. My contention is that World War II would kind of serve as the reason for the dissipation of that. Okay? Certain things were more important, survival, for example. And Father John Hurley has written kind of his memories of those war years. He was the American mission superior, and it's an interesting work, something that enables me, I think, to appreciate how this American superior of the Jesuits in the Philippines really saw that the Filipino was neither European nor American. Okay? He saw it, okay? And tried therefore to mitigate some of the problems then coming up. Okay, and in fact, during the war, when Father Hurley was himself imprisoned in Santo Tomas, everything that the Jesuits had to do, all the offices of the Jesuits were taken over by Filipino Jesuits. Father Sigdion would become the vice superior of the mission, and other Filipinos would then cover for their American counterparts. So by the time we get to the 1950s, I think what we have here is a kind of the coming back, as it were, of that whole Filipinization thing that was making itself felt in the 1930s. This will break out in the 1950s, the late 1950s, and would touch institutions like the Ateneo de Manila at some point, with the first Filipino president or rector of the Ateneo de Manila finally being put in place. And the last American Jesuit to be the president was Father Donnellan, who was in fact my professor in English when I was a junior. Okay, so so as you can see, this covers, I think, the whole lot of it, and therefore further research is needed to try to cover, because there are many things that remain kind of below the surface. Okay? I think the article of June Aguilar and OBC, published in Philippine Studies on Horacio de la Costa and Philippinization, is a very important article. And maybe we need non-Jesuits to be able to state the facts as baldly as possible, because a Jesuit would probably have some difficulty in trying to write about the history of his own religious community. So thank you very much for your kind attention and your patience.
Okay, thank you, Father Tony. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. I will proceed to the open forum part again. I'd just like to ask the speakers during the first forum to also kindly join us, just in case there are still other questions, or perhaps you can raise questions to one another regarding each other's presentation. But first, the first question is for Father Ansem. The question is, Why didn't the Benedictines come at the same time as the friars or even as early as the Jesuits? Huh? Why did they only arrive toward the later part of the 19th century?
Yes. One of the reasons behind that is that the nature of the Benedictine order is that it is contemplative. And I would like to also mention that for example, Montserrat could not have sent monks to the Philippines earlier because earlier in the 1860s, the monastery was still reeling from the effects of the Napoleonic Wars. So it was really impossible to send missionaries to the colonies of Spain because monasteries were, as I have said, struggling with the concept of not having enough monks in the monasteries.
Thank you for your answer, Father Ansem. We see the question here for Father Tony in the chat box. Perhaps you also saw it already. One important religious order that arrived in the Philippines was the Hospitallers of St. John of God in 1611. By the early part of the 19th century, they already had Filipinos in their order as lay members known as donados. Would the same apply to various religious orders?
Yes, there were some, and I think this is where Father Schumacher precisely would talk about, but they were really exceptions. No? There was no clear policy of admitting Filipinos into the religious orders. There were exceptions. Lay brothers, we used to call them, hermanos legos, but those reaching the priesthood would be very, very rare. No? The Jesuits, of course, we have to understand that their history in the Philippines is divided into two. No? They arrived in 1581, and then they were basically kicked out of Spain and all Spanish dominions in 1767, 1768. Okay? Jesuits would disappear from the Philippines for 91 years. They would arrive only in 1859. So I think to some extent, we can understand why, because of this long absence of almost 100 years, the Jesuits, therefore, were not really in a position to develop, to come up with a policy of accepting Filipinos into their ranks. No? Although, in fact, they would be the first to do so as a matter of policy and as a matter of principle. No? I don't know whether Father Manalastas would like to say something about when the Benedictines, for example, decided to accept Filipinos into the Benedictine order, no, in the Philippines. No? But for the Jesuits, they were the first to do so as a matter of policy. I think it's important to state that, and as my paper then lays it out, in 1913 they finally opened the novitiate, which is the first most important house, you might say, to begin the formation of people. So I don't know whether Father Ansem would like to. Would you know, Father Ansem? Actually, I have two questions. One would be precisely that, but the second is, what happened to the Benedictines after your stint in Surigao? You would leave the missions in Mindanao at some point.
Yeah. As far as to accept Filipinos into the community only in the 1950s. So it was Abbot Gusi, our second abbot, who spearheaded the Filipinization. He wanted to recruit as many Filipinos as possible. As you would understand, monastic communities are autonomous. So each monastery will have its own government, its own economy, its own apostolate, charism, what have you. So it was Abbot Gusi who thought that it would be best to admit already Filipinos, because by then Spaniards from were not really coming over to become members of the community. As far as the second question is concerned, Father, after our 12-year stint in Surigao, the community decided in 1901 to establish a school. A while ago, there was a discussion about the Escuela Normal, no? And the normal school that the Americans put up. Well, the Benedictines did their share in trying to, for lack of a better term, combat the ill effects of the Protestant assault on the Catholic Church, because they decided to establish San Beda, El Colegio de San Beda, to really combat the ill effects of the Thomasites, no, who were instrumental in establishing the normal school. Well, we left Surigao because the superiors thought that it would not be a sustainable and feasible enterprise anymore. Besides, you will remember too that the Benedictines were in a way traumatized, no, by the incarceration that they suffered in the hands of the revolutionarios. So they thought of calling all the missionaries back, and since it was a convenient thing because the apostolic delegate then was a Benedictine, no, Ambrosius Agius, they made representations with the apostolic delegate to look for another congregation that would be willing to administer the parishes. And so the missionaries of the Sacred Heart succeeded the Benedictines in Surigao.
Thank you, Father Anselm. We have a question from Kevin to Father Anselm. Kevin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. I really enjoyed this presentation, Father Tony. I hope I can treat you this way. I have two questions. After the creation of Propaganda Fide, one of the topics that become debated often is the notion, or is it the debate around if natives could have access to ordination, so to be ordained priests and then to be ordained bishops, as you well know. So in the Portuguese case, you have this figure, the Mateus de Castro, that is appointed as bishop in 1625. And so this kind of creates the environment for a large debate if Brahmins could or should be ordained priests, or if they didn't have the capacities. So often we will find letters from the nuncios in Madrid or in Lisbon, or from friars in the Philippines or Macau, saying, well, the Filipinos shouldn't be ordained because they don't have the ability. Japanese can be, the Brahmins maybe, sometimes yes, sometimes not. What I find striking is that the same argument of constancy is used in the case of Brahmins in the 17th century to say that they are not capable because they don't have the constancy. They will lose faith if they are ordained bishops. So usually some historians will say that this is a matter of sort of a struggle for power. European friars don't want to share their offices. They don't want to share the higher offices in the religious orders. And yet here you are once again with the 20th century kind of using the same arguments. But I was wondering, what are the explanations that you find for this debate to last for so long? And do they indeed think that the Filipinos are inferior culturally still in the 20th century? Is this a matter of not wanting to share power, as some authors defend? What is the reason behind this difference? And also, this is more of a curiosity on my part. You talk about the Americans not interfering much in the church. Is it normal for imperial American system to kind of have an intervention in the orders or the religious orders in places where in the 20th century in places where American had a stronger intervention as they did in the Philippines? This is a true question. I don't know. I wasn't expecting, I wouldn't be expecting for the American imperialism to have this face or to have this role, but I may be wrong. And that would be all. Thank you.
Father Anselm?
Yeah, I would like to mention that in his study of the Philippinization of the Filipino Dominicans, which actually is a study of not only the Dominicans, but majority of the religious orders that were already in the Philippines. Father De La Rosa actually mentioned an intriguing factor, and that is the so-called limpieza de sangre, no? The purity of blood, which was actually a carryover from the Mexican experience. No? Well, it's a totally different study, but in a nutshell, one of the reasons why it took so long, no, for the religious orders to accept Filipinos into their ranks is that of this concept of they're not of pure blood. No? Well, of course, we would later learn that Filipinos are not less equipped, no, as far as intellectual capacity is concerned, because as early as the time of Pelaez, no, Father Pelaez and Father Burgos, that's exactly what they were trying to prove to the Spaniards, no, that we're not in any way less intelligent than you are. In fact, we can obtain doctorate degrees in the university. We are capable. It's just that, for lack of a better term, there were no ample opportunities, no, for given to Filipinos to become members of religious orders.
If I may add to that, I think one reason, see, here's the funny thing about this. The Dominicans, for example, accepted Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese into their ranks, okay? Because the Dominicans in the Philippines also sent missionaries to these places, and they accepted them. Okay? In fact, the first Chinese bishop ordained, at least before the Roman Catholic bishop ordained before the 20th century, Bishop Gregory Lo, I think was his name. The Spanish Dominicans gave him the surname of Lopez, okay, was educated at the University of Santo Tomas. So the whole question of, so it's not as if, so it seems that for the missionaries throughout these centuries, there has been a hierarchy of Asian cultures and civilizations, okay? And therefore, the Filipino compares rather badly with the Chinese, with the Japanese, with the Vietnamese, with perhaps even the Indian, etc. No? So how to explain that? I guess it's because of the European fascination for the fact that China, for example, really, Jesuits are partly to be blamed for this, okay? They praise China to high heavens, no? Here is a society that did not know the Christian revelation, and yet they had this bureaucracy, they had this system of governance, etc., etc. So go back to Valignano, to Matteo Ricci, to many of these great missionaries. Okay? So the Europeans had a very high estimation of China, of Japan, but certainly a very low estimation of native society. Now, the thing is, though, I think the other thing that we need to consider here is that European society also evolves and changes. Something happens in the late 19th century. Okay, in the 1800s, okay, and the late 18th century and the early 19th century. This time, Spain, of course, and here we, you know, by the middle of the 19th century, Spain would lose most of its Latin American colonies. Right? and therefore the Spanish Empire was a rather poor image of what it used to be. Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Marianas Islands, etc. No? And something happens, I think, in the 19th century when perhaps with the influence as well of the pseudoscience of social Darwinism and all of that. Okay, and it's very interesting to try to study the kind of science then that was being propagated, for example, among certain circles, no? Measuring, for example, skulls and brains, and the Filipino was inferior, etc. No? And of course, those exhibitions that took place in Europe, in Madrid, and etc., showing off. And this is the reason why the Ilustrados in Spain were so angry, as it were, at the Spanish colonial setup, no? Showcasing, you might say, what was considered primitive, etc. So I think at some point, and here the whole question is whether racism becomes, you might say, a real question. Okay? This was not to the fore, I think, in the 16th and 17th centuries, but in the 18th and 19th century, something happens, okay? And the colonizers become more racist than they were before. Before, there was perhaps a greater attention paid to the social status of native inhabitants, you know, whether you're a Datu or you're etc. But by the time we get to the 19th century, the image of the Filipino that is presented to them by their colonizers is that they're children. This is a recurring image. The Filipino is a child that has not grown up. Okay? So even at the turn of the century, in considering, for example, Filipino bishops, the first Filipino bishop was named only in 1906. The Spanish bishops, Nozalera and the other bishops, continued to oppose the nomination and ordination of a Filipino to become a bishop. So the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, or the Aglipayan Church, just had to happen before finally the church would pay attention to this. No? So I think, as Father Manlastas also said, the secular clergy, the diocesan clergy, had their own pantheon of heroes. No, beginning in the 1700s, when probably the first Filipinos, Indios, Mestizos, etc., were ordained, and this would continue all the way up to the Revolution. Filipino parish priests were deprived of their parishes and were given to the members of the religious orders. So actually, one of the most vociferous opponents of the Spanish, of the friars, so-called friars, and the colonial state were the Filipino clergy themselves, who felt the injustice most strongly in this situation. So I don't know whether that answers Kevin's question, but it's a...
Okay, thank you, Father Anselm and Father Tony. Kevin, do you set a follow-up question?
I give the full remarks or maximum score to the answer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Additional questions for Father Tony. Was there a Jesuit policy shift from the Spanish Jesuits to the American Jesuits, particularly as concerns educational policy? And since there was a transition from the Spanish Jesuits to the American Jesuits, were there tensions between them?
I think basically, well, the American Jesuits, when they came in, basically continued that policy that was set up first by the Spanish Jesuits. No? So, so the novitiate, that's why precisely the novitiate become a bone of contention between them, because when the mission was already transferred to the Maryland, New York province. So therefore, the American Jesuits would now become the superiors, the heads of schools, etc. The novitiate remained in the hands of the Spanish Jesuits, no? And therefore, so they would continue it. Okay, but I think one point that the American Jesuits would bring up is the whole. Why is it they say so? There was this. It's a kind of a culture war between Spanish Jesuits and American Jesuits. No? For example, comments made by, it's an interesting thing to dig deeper into this. Like the American Jesuits considered the spirituality of the Filipino student under the Spanish Jesuits as a kind of effeminate spirituality. So this is an image that is striking. The American Jesuits, okay. So the machismo of the American Jesuit, and one of the American Jesuits would in fact introduce boxing into the curriculum of Ateneo de Manila, and the Spanish Jesuits were horrified, okay, by this. Okay? To the point where they reported to Rome, okay? and the general had to deal with this situation, and the American Jesuit concerned actually wrote back to Father General and complaining about why is Father General taking the side of the Spanish Jesuits. No? So there's a whole the culture wars that we see in the United States today. For example, was in many form was there at that time. So maybe for the American Jesuits, their big question was this: why is it that the students of the Jesuits in the Ateneo de Manila did not want to become Jesuits? And the answer given by the American Jesuits was that it's because the novitiate was in the hands of the Spanish Jesuits. And these Ateneo boys, still a boys' school, did not want to go through formation under the Spanish Jesuits. So this is the main argument of Father Schumacher, others, that precisely you have this Hispanic thing and American thing, Hispanization and Americanization. I'm saying that I don't think this is the whole picture.
Yeah. If I may add, we also had the same experience, no, in the Abbey, because of course we were a Spanish foundation, no, and there was a time in our history when after the Great Depression, the Abbey was put under the apostolic administration of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. And so there were some American monks who came over to the Philippines to manage the school and to, in a way, infuse new ideas. And in their accounts, in their memoirs, they were really having difficulty dealing with the Spaniards because they don't seem to accept that the situation was already different, that we are not anymore under the Spanish regime, no? And I believe that would trickle down also to the relationship that our Filipino monks had with the Spaniards, no, the remnants of the Spaniards who were in the Abbey, because they really had a different worldview, no? And therefore it would even reach as far as the discussions on food, no, what they were having on the table. So the Spaniards would object to certain food that the Filipinos were having, no? So there is this idea that it took quite some time for them to accept that things were no longer under the Spanish regime.
Okay, thank you, Father Ansem. Father Ansem, there's a question. If somebody is interested in conducting research about the Benedictines in the Philippines, where does one go?
Well, they can try to visit the Abbey, and we will try to assist them in whatever way we can.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have questions or comments about any of the presentations? Part one, both parts one and two. Or do the speakers have a reaction to each other's presentation? Okay, since there are no comments or questions, I'd like to once again thank all of our speakers. Thank you, Father Ansem. Thank you, Father Tony. Thank you to all the speakers in part one of our panel here. We have a few announcements actually. Let me just share that. Okay, I call on Nikki.
So from a discussion on religious institutions tomorrow, we jump to a discussion on something quite different. It's about trade relations. We have a special panel tomorrow organized by the Philippine Embassy in Portugal. The panel is From Spices to
panel
Startups,
here.
Philippine-Portuguese Trade Relations
We have
from 4 to 7 p.m.
announcements,
Philippine time,
let me just
and
share
that will be 9 o'clock in Portuguese time. There will be three themes.
call
The
on,
first theme is
Nikki.
economic diplomacy never tasted
So
this
from a
good.
discussion
And we're going
on
to talk
religious
about
institutions tomorrow,
Mabuti
we
Sardines.
jump to-
The second would be Web Summit. And that is the participation of Philippine startups in the largest web event that is based in Lisbon. And the third is on Philippine investment in Portugal and Portuguese investment in the Philippines. Please join us tomorrow. And the final panel next week will be on Tuesday. The topic would be the city. It will be the philosophy department and Dr. Momok Barbasa, who will be moderating a much awaited talk. There will be 4 speakers: Danny Herona, Christy Flannery, Ross Costello, and Gary De Villas. Join us on Tuesday for the final panel of part 3. So those are the upcoming events. Thank you for giving me time to share them. Back to you, Dr. Mendoza. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
On behalf of the School of Humanities of the Ateneo de Manila University and our partners, CHUM, Centro de Humanidades, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National and Centennial Commission, I thank all of you for joining us today. Maraming salamat. I do hope that you have found this panel a very fruitful one for you. Okay, thank you. Gracias.
Okay, I think our live